look at the satellite to start things off. Just some reference here. This is Mexico, and we look over to Cuba and also the Florida Keys. Strengthening here, we see continuing to develop and look a little better. With time, you're going to start seeing these rain bands move further north, and that's what we're going to have to watch out for some of this heavy rain. You can see the extent here. Hurricane force winds 30 miles from the center, and we're actually, much larger, about 170, 175 miles or so on the tropical storm force winds. So with time, we are forecasting continuing strengthening. And then by looking into Tuesday becoming a major hurricane, and look at this, even staying a major hurricane here with landfall on the panhandle of Florida coast. We do have a hurricane watch in that same area, so landfall could be anywhere in that area. However, we always talk about not really paying attention to that exact point of landfall, because you look at the extent of those impacts can stretch well outside the cone. The cone is basically looking at our error over the last 5 years, and those impacts could be well outside, and we're going to have a lot of impacts with the system because we are forecasting a major hurricane. Could see winds, the latest information that we have, looking to potentially be about 120 miles an hour at landfall. So this is a very serious situation when you look at the impacts to the Florida Panhandle and even beyond going inland. Let's look at some of those impacts. One of them is going to be that wind. And one thing we talk about for preparedness, it's very important to look at the arrival of tropical storm force winds. And the latest information we have, if you look overnight Tuesday into Wednesday, we're going to start seeing the tropical storm force winds approach the coast. We need to be done. So you have today, you have tomorrow. You really have to have tomorrow to wrap things up, because you're going to start seeing these overnight, the tropical storm force winds into Wednesday morning start to arrive. So we talk about this be ready by. The real takeaway here is you have today, you have tomorrow to get ready, and then when these tropical storm force winds arrive, it becomes too dangerous to really start being outside doing your preparations. Start looking at the rainfall as one of the big impacts.
Yeah, technical problem here. Okay, go ahead.
So one of the big impacts that we have, we talk about rainfall not just being a coastal issue, but inland. So let's take a look at that rain. In the orange here, 6 to 10 inches of rain, maybe some areas even getting to 12 inches. And that stretches around Tallahassee up through central portions of Georgia. But remember this, depending on the track, sometimes you could see these values slide back and forth. So be careful when you're right at the edges here. You could see some of those higher rainfall amounts, and that just can cause all sorts of issues associated with flash flooding and also river flooding. So inland flooding is a big issue, but the storm surge is something that we've been talking about, and half the fatalities in tropical systems is a storm surge. This is a part of the Gulf of Mexico, incredibly vulnerable to that storm surge. And you look at some of the values here from Apalachicola over to really looking over the Crystal River, 8 to 12 foot possible. And not every place gets that, but it's really where the water gets funneled. You start pushing the water in, the water gets trapped and start building up when it gets into the coastline. And that's something that we really need to watch with time. And even if you get further away from the center, this is an important point. It's not just around the center, even further out. You start getting towards Spring Hill off the coastline, even off the coastline of Tampa, 2 to 4 feet, 4 to 6 feet. And even on, we really try to include areas that could actually, Panama City, what we're looking at there is, we're looking at the error. That's what could happen. 5 to 8 feet possible in those areas, depending on the track. Little wiggles matter when it comes to storm surge. And I do want to really concentrate on the storm surge and take the time to really look at these values. Look at the vulnerability we have here. The red, looking at greater than 9 foot of storm surge. Once again, you start getting that onshore flow and the water gets completely trapped into those areas. And we really want to highlight some trouble spots. We really like to talk about some of these areas. You look at Apalachicola, look at these low-lying areas that can get significant amounts of storm surge there. And really, it's not just talking about the coastline. If you notice, the barrier islands get inundated. The water keeps pushing in to the East Bay, pushing up the Apalachicola River. And with time, it even goes further up the Apalachicola River. So if you live along these areas, you really need to be ready. You think you're pretty far inland, but as a matter of fact, some of these rivers can flow backward and keep pushing inland with time. Some other trouble spots that we want to key on here, we look at Alligator Harbor, we look at Bald Point State Park, all the water that gets into these areas, the Ochlockonee Bay and coming up the Ochlockonee River. Look how far. This is a really important point because there's a lot of people that live along these rivers, the Ochlockonee River just being one of them. Look how far inland some of those values can push, greater than 9 foot in some of those areas. So storm surge, taking these areas that normally drain the water out, and in this case, pushes the water in and then ends up really piling up in these areas. So if you live there, you really need to be ready for this. You start looking some other areas. You look at Panacea here, where the water comes in and starts impacting some of these populated areas as well. St. Mark. So once again, look at south of Crawfordville. You know, just the low-lying areas, you're pushing the water inland and following the lowest land. So just south of Crawfordville, be careful if you live out in these areas, because it could push quite a bit inland. And one last trouble spot is really looking at the Suwannee River. Once again, normally flowing outward to get rid of the rain, storm surge pushes the water in, and as a result you start seeing some of these higher values and inundation all along the river south of Fanning Springs and Old Town. So this is something that we're looking at, and once again, storm surge is going to be one of the bigger factors, and of course your inland rain. We have to be ready for this. We have today, we have tomorrow to get ready, but this is a major hurricane, and you can have some very dangerous storm surge, life-threatening storm surge that we have to be ready for. Marine hazards is something I didn't mention yet, and I do want to walk over, as we have before, to our tropical analysis forecast branch, because we want to make sure that we cover some of the issues for mariners and boaters. And we'll talk to Chris Lancy over here. And Chris, we were talking about, you know, the dangers to boaters and you know, anybody out there in the waters. You start getting these high seas and swells. Can you tell us what you're concerned with?
Yeah, right now as Hurricane Michael makes its way up in the Gulf, the colors indicate the real high waves. So the whites and the purples indicate 12-foot or higher waves. And as the hurricane gets stronger, perhaps up to Category 3, we expect peak wave heights up to about 40 feet. Of course, those aren't going to be impacting right at the coast, but anywhere from Tampa all the way to New Orleans are going to be having strong onshore winds, some dangerous waves affecting the coast. So anyone with marine interest need to be preparing today and by tomorrow at the latest for the Hurricane Michael to impact the area.
Well, there you go. We cover all the hazards. Hurricane Michael, a very dangerous hurricane with all the hazards, from storm surge to the the heavy rainfall causing the flash flooding. We'll have the wind. Think about, you start thinking about the wind speeds of 120 miles an hour stretching inland, and the rain. Once again, falling trees, the dangers of that, and also the power outages, long-lasting power outages in some areas, and as Chris covered, the impacts to the mariners as well. So we got to be ready. We got today, we got tomorrow to be ready, and then we need to be ready for this system. And remember, well inland, it's not just a coastal thing, it could stretch well inland, so we need to be ready for that too. So this has been Ken Graham right here live in the National Hurricane Center's operations area.